Hey Beacon, welcome home to your Bounce Back Blueprint Community podcast, where you are challenged to be, do, and have God's best as you thrive on your journey from setback to success. I'm your Bounce Back guide, Tiffany Huff Struthers, and I'll be guiding you on the journey by sharing tips, tools, and the tea on how I was able to bounce back from escaping death, healing from heartbreak, and finding hope in homelessness. And then I wrote an award-winning book all about it. And shout out to God, ever since I was courageous enough to share my story, my life and the lives of women around the world have been forever changed. And as a member of the Bounce Back Blueprint community, I'm called to teach you to do the same. So grab your journal and let's build this blueprint. Hey Beacon, hey, I hope you are well. And I'm so glad to have you back here today for episode 29, y'all. Can you believe it? It's episode 29. I am so excited about this. And in case you missed it, we are now doing 2 episodes a week. So you can now look forward to getting a good word, getting and working toward building that blueprint on Wednesdays and Saturdays. So if you missed the episode this past Saturday, the self-care struggle, I strongly encourage you to go back and take a listen. Now, this week, we are continuing to talk about imposter syndrome. And I didn't know last week when I started, but God made it clear to me that this is going to be a series. So we'll be working through imposter syndrome through the end of the month. The first episode, which was episode 27, was the root of imposter syndrome. And again, if you haven't listened, go ahead back and tune in. I believe it will bless you. Today, we're going to talk about the power of imposter syndrome, right? So the root of imposter syndrome talked about where it starts. And today, in the power of imposter syndrome, I want to talk about how imposter syndrome really is maintained, right? What gives it the power to consume you, to undermine what God has said about you, to make you doubt, to attempt to defeat you, right? And while I am sure there are a number of other variants that potentially give power to imposter syndrome in your life, in my life, in the lives of others, there are 2 specific ones that, well, actually 3 specific ones that I want to dig into today. So without further ado, if you haven't already, grab your coffee, grab your tea, grab your journal, and let's build this blueprint. So we talked about a little earlier on how detrimental unforgiveness can be, right? And today I wanted to dig in a bit deeper about unforgiveness and how it leads to distraction, right? So the first 2 right off the top are unforgiveness and distraction. And I want to really dig into how unforgiveness leads to distraction and how both give way to imposter syndrome. And when I say distraction, I want you to think about these 3 keys, right? When you are struggling with or refuse to forgive, right? When you're struggling with unforgiveness and you're letting it fester and you're carrying it around with you, even when you are walking with the facade that you are fully trusting in God, if you have not forgiven, you can and likely will or have been distracted in one or all of these 3 ways. First of all, it distracts you from your identity, right? So when you're distracted from your identity, like we talked about in the root, you don't have confidence in who you are because you don't have confidence in who God is. And largely because you feel like something you've done has been so horrible that God can't love you, you can't be a divine creation, and that He can't forgive you. And I am praying that you know that is contrary to the Word of God. In 1 John 1 verse 9, it says, if we confess our sins, He is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. And so when we aren't willing to or when we don't have that confidence in God, right, we get distracted by our mistakes because we don't believe and we aren't willing to take God at his word. And so we're distracted from our identity. The second thing that happens when you're distracted is that it changes your pace, right? It makes you either want to speed things up and get ahead of God, or you're distracted so much that you're moving very slowly or that you're stagnant, right? And most of the time when we are distracted and it interferes with our pace, we are right at the point of breakthrough. And that's why the enemy is going to try so hard to distract us from um the path God has us on, because he doesn't want us to have that breakthrough. He wants us to get into a place where we are distracted, we make a mistake, and then back to that cycle of unforgiveness. And then the third way that distract or unforgiveness leads to a distraction is that when you are harboring something and perhaps you're hiding it, right? Like I said, you have that facade that you're trusting God, but really you're not, because you're focusing so heavily on living out that lie, right? Or protecting that secret about unforgiveness, you can be presented with a counterfeit and not even know it, right? And this is really important to be aware of on this bounce back journey, right? Because let's just be honest, we do want to speed up the bounce back process. It's challenging, it's painful at times. It takes a lot out of us. There's a lot of healing that has to take place, right? There are a lot of, and so sometimes we are attracted to miracle grow when we are distracted by unforgiveness, right? So it presents an opportunity for the enemy to slide in the DMs or slide up in our phones or even our email inboxes, right? Or to even send someone who looks like they're presenting us with an opportunity, but in reality, it's an obstacle, right? So I want to look at the story of David, and you may be familiar of the story of David and Bathsheba. This story is found in Second Samuel, and it's a lot, right? So it happens over the course of 2 chapters, 2 Samuel 11 and 2 Samuel 12. I strongly encourage you to go back and read the entirety of these 2 verses. However, I love to break things down with the Tiff's Notes version. So here's the Tiff's Notes version. David is doing his thing. They are defeating all types of armies and enemies, right? And even though there are still more battles to fight, David decides he's going to take a rest. He's going to stay home in Jerusalem. In the meantime, he happens upon his rooftop, probably chilling. Like, everybody loves a rooftop party, even if it's a party of one. I would love to be on a rooftop with my journal and my tea first thing in the morning, just having my quiet time with God. I don't know why David was going up on that rooftop. However, he went up on the rooftop. He noticed that one of his best soldiers' wife, Bathsheba, was over there, and she was beautiful. And so he sent for her, and long story short, he and Bathsheba get down behind Uriah's back, and he feels guilty. David is battling with unforgiveness, though it does not necessarily say this directly in the text. Based on his actions, he's feeling some remorse, right, for what has happened, and he wants to hide it, right, because he does not want his identity as it relates to how other people see him to be challenged, right? He doesn't want others to be distracted from his identity, and he doesn't want to himself be presented as a counterfeit. So he tries to cover his tracks, and he gets so consumed with the unforgiveness that he in fact kills Uriah. He sets Uriah up. Again, I'm not going to go into the details of the story, but because of the level of power he had, he was able to instruct both Uriah and others in positions of power to do specific things that would ultimately lead to the death of Uriah. Now, because God is so bomb, he didn't want David to feel like he could go on fronting, right? Pretending, being an imposter, and thinking no one knew what was up, right? So God sends sends for David, right? And he has, well, actually has Nathan send for David. And this is in chapter 12. And basically he shares this parable about a rich man and a poor man, and how the rich man, again, the person in power, took advantage of the poor man ultimately because he could, right? And in 2 Samuel 12:5, it says, David burned with anger against the man and said to Nathan, as surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this must die. And in 7, Nathan said to David, you are the man. This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says. So ultimately, the Lord wanted David to know, like, I see you, I know what you did, and you need to, we got to deal with this. And so I share that example, and it is a bit extreme, right? I am praying that whatever you have yet to forgive yourself or someone else for would not lead you to murder, right? But that is the power of imposter syndrome. When we are so distracted from our identity, when we are so distracted that we're speeding up or slowing down and refusing to align with God's pace for our lives, when we are so consumed with the secret of what we haven't been willing to forgive, that we are distracted by counterfeits, right? Because David made Bathsheba his wife. She wasn't the woman God had for him. In fact, in 2 Samuel 12, God says to David, I have given you this, this, and this, and in fact would have given you more if that weren't enough, but you felt like you had to go and take something that didn't belong to you. So ultimately in this situation, Bathsheba was the counterfeit being presented to David that he took because he was so distracted with his own unforgiveness, right? After he murdered Uriah, he made Bathsheba his wife. She was already pregnant. I don't know if I said that or not, but sis was already pregnant. So they were just doing the most. So this is a very extreme example, but I want you to consider how unforgiveness that you're dealing with is challenging your ability to defeat imposter syndrome, because unforgiveness is giving power to distraction, which is giving power to imposter syndrome, right? I want you to take a moment and really think about and ask yourself, how is unforgiveness distracting me from my identity? And how is that distraction giving imposter syndrome power over my life? And you might be thinking, no, I know who I am. I'm a child of God. And I hear you and I receive that. And I do believe that you are a child of God. However, what I know for sure is that you cannot execute in excellence when you are distracted from the truth of your identity. You cannot operate fully in your identity if you're distracted from it. And unforgiveness, as much as we hate to admit it, is a huge distraction, right? Because it undermines our confidence in God. So, how is the power you're giving unforgiveness distracting you from your identity? How is the power you're giving unforgiveness causing you to speed up or slow down your walk with Christ, your walk and your purpose? And I can be very transparent and tell you that this was a challenge for me. So in late 2018, God made it very clear to me. He gave me the vision for this women's conference, and he gave me the theme, and he was very specific about where it would take place and how it would take place. The challenge, though, was that I wanted to be sure that this happened, and I wanted it to happen sooner than later, because I felt like there were so many other visions God had given me that I had not fully been able to execute. Ultimately, I hadn't forgiven myself for not manifesting all of what God had given me. However, the caveat to that was that God was teaching me that he was giving me vision to prepare me, right? Every vision that God gives you is not to be executed now. And so what happened, because I was still harboring unforgiveness for other things I felt like I hadn't accomplished, other things that God had given me to do that for whatever reason hadn't come to fruition, that I was distracted, and I started to speed up the process. And when we speed up the process, things go awry because we take control from God, right? I know a lot of times in the culture today, everybody is like, start before you're ready. And I am one to agree with that, right? You can't let your fears stop you. You can't allow your fears to stagnate you. However, you have to be careful that when you are thinking about starting before you're ready, you don't allow yourself to get ahead of God. And that's what I allowed myself to do. And because I allowed myself to get distracted and I attempted to get ahead of God, once again, I wasn't able to execute. Not because God had lied to me, not because I'm not capable, but because I tried to execute that vision before it was the appointed time, right? If you listen to that scripture in Habakkuk 2 and 3, it says, wait on it, right? It says there is an appointed time. And so I want you to think about where you are on this journey, right? What visions God has given you, what promises God has made to you, what He is whispering to you in your quiet time to Him when you're praying. And I want you to take the time, I want you to be willing to invest in hearing specifically from Him about when you are supposed to move. Now, I'm not telling you to sit there and wait for something to fall from the sky, right? You do have to still be engaged in active waiting, and you do have to do what you know to do next. What I'm saying is, don't try and rush God because you feel like the internet is rushing you. And also, in the same token, where are you dragging your feet? Right? And I feel like this unforgiveness and this distraction of slowing down or dragging our feet or getting stagnant or claiming that we are stuck often is reminiscent of those personal pandemics I have been impressing upon you to consider, right? Because what happens when we start to drag our feet, that thing, it grows. That thing, it builds up. And so as that thing builds up, as it grows, and the lie that we need to pretend to be someone other than ourselves becomes greater, right? The power of imposter syndrome over our lives becomes stronger. And here's an example. And this is, again, another personal example. When my father got sick in 2015, I started to gain weight. I was caring for him. I had recently left my job. I was listening and believing God for this business that He was telling me I was to start, and it felt like things were out of control. And I was alone for a large part of the process, just trying to figure everything out. And I started to find comfort in food. So not even 3 years prior to that, I had gone through this extreme transformation, done all of the work, changed my lifestyle, and lost about 70 pounds. But between 2015 and 2017, my father passed away in 16. So over the course of that 3 years, I have gained not only the 675 or so pounds that I've lost, but additional weight. And that is because I have been dragging my feet, because I have been carrying the unforgiveness associated with, the fact that I gained the weight back. I've been carrying the unforgiveness associated with allowing the enemy to distract me from my identity and convince me that it's all my fault. I should have been able to handle it. I should not have, made the decisions that I made as it relates to eating. And also because I was so distracted, the enemy was presenting me with counterfeits through food, right? Showing me or had convinced me, I should say, that that was the best comfort and that my health didn't matter. Now, again, don't hear me saying that I'm blaming all of this on the enemy. What I am saying is because I chose to drag my feet, because I chose not to forgive myself for the mistakes that I made in the past, I created the space for the enemy to come in and feed me those lies. And those lies look like cookies and cakes and pies and a myriad of other things. Thank God I am on the other side of that. However, what I know to be true is that because I had allowed the enemy to distract me, because I had dragged my feet, I was embarrassed, right? And when we are embarrassed, when people see us, right? The whole what you do in the dark always comes to light. When people see us, they see even those things that we thought we could hide in the dark. It didn't matter what kind of dress I put on, it didn't matter what kind of Spanx I bought. People could see visibly that I had gained a lot of weight and ultimately irresponsibly, right? And so I had to get to the point where I was prepared and willing to forgive myself. And I was willing and prepared to place all of my confidence in God that if I had done it before, I could do it again and permanently. And I had to decide that I was no longer going to allow the enemy to use food against me. So again, David's story was extreme, right? He murdered someone, but we could be murdering ourselves with the personal pandemics that we are facing, whether it is being overweight and our health being challenged, whether it is being in toxic relationships that are impacting our mental health negatively, whether it is shrinking down when people or allowing people to convince us that we don't deserve or we don't have whatever fill in the blank it takes to do what we know God has called us to do. And so I really want you to consider how unforgiveness, specifically of yourself in this case, and your past mistakes or what you have been considering your past failures is giving power to imposter syndrome in your life. So I said I had three things. The first was unforgiveness, right? The second was distraction. And the third is kind of an edge snatcher. And it is that you're undisciplined, right? If you are not disciplined, then you give so much power to imposter syndrome. Because here's what happens when you're not disciplined, you aren't going to see the results of your labor in the same way, right? You're not going to feel the same way you would feel if you were doing things consistently. Ultimately, when you're not disciplined, you're being a poor steward. And when you're being a poor steward, when you're not disciplined, you start to feel like you need to make excuses for why you haven't accomplished XYZ or why you aren't measuring up to whatever standard you've set or for whatever you've told people you were going to do or what God said he was going to do in your life, right? So now you've got to come up with excuses to justify the lie that God isn't doing what he said he would do. Or you've got to come up with excuses for why you aren't doing what you said you would do. And I am a firm believer that discipline is the bridge to your destiny, right? If God has already told you what to do, it's not necessarily true that you do it one time. Everything God gives us is not a one and done. There are some things that are going to take time. It's not going to be a day, it may not be a week, it may be years. But you have to stay disciplined. And if you're not willing to stay disciplined, then you do give power to imposter syndrome because it looks like you're pretending to be who God already called you to be. And so I want you to consider if you look over this year, right? We're in September now, my Lord. And of course, there has been a lot going on in the world, but there are some things that God has, even in the midst of these national pandemics, God has been placing on your heart and convicting you into correction about addressing as it relates to your personal pandemics, even in the midst of everything that is going on. There are certain things that you have said, I'll start Monday, I'll start the first of the month, I'll start when the weather changes, and God is saying now is the time. And because you aren't willing to commit, you're giving more and more power to imposter syndrome, because it's like, well, God says this is who I am, but I can't see it and I don't feel it and it doesn't look the way God would tell me it would look. Well, guess what God is saying? What I told you to do isn't looking the way I told you to do it, because you're being inconsistent. So where in your life are you being inconsistent in the things that God has assigned you to do that is allowing imposter syndrome to take hold over you? I'm going to ask you that again. Where in your life are you being inconsistent, undisciplined in the things that God has told you to do that is allowing imposter syndrome to have power over you? Yeah, I had to let that marinate for a minute, because these are such important questions. And here is why. Because on this bounce back journey, the worst thing that you can do is continue to climbing to the top of a ladder because you refuse to come down and start at the bottom of the right one. And a lot of times that's why we aren't disciplined in what God is telling us to do, because it requires us to begin again. And sometimes it requires us to begin again more than once. And if this is you, I am encouraging and challenging you to course correct today. Wherever it is that you're at the top of that ladder, pretending to be someone other than who God has called you to be, because you haven't forgiven yourself, because you've allowed whatever unforgiveness you're harboring to distract you from who you are. God sent me here today through your headphones or the speaker on your phone or wherever you are listening to let you know that it's time for you to take your power back. It's time for you to take your power back. The world needs the woman God called and created you to be. The world needs the gifts that God has placed deep down inside of you that you've buried under the unforgiveness and lack of discipline and the distractions. The world needs you to show up as you and do the things that God has called you to do. The world needs for you to bounce back. And in order for you to do that, you have to be on your God ordained track. You have to take your power back. And I'm excited to share with you the opportunity to be supported and challenged through this process at the very first ever Coffee and Clarity virtual experience on Saturday, September 19th, 2020. You are invited to join us for Coffee and Clarity Purpose Over Pandemics. Coffee and Clarity is a mini retreat where you are going to be, again, challenged and encouraged while you are making covenant connections with like-minded women of God who are ready to really set themselves and others free by doing and being what God has called you to be. Through these sessions, you will grow your faith and you will gain clarity on God's vision and purpose for your life. You will be equipped with immediately actionable steps that you can take today to begin to eradicate those personal pandemics that you are dealing with, so that you can get to work on building the blueprint and blessing the world by walking in and living out your purpose. Here is what other beacons like you are saying about their experience at Coffee and Clarity.
Like, my life was changing. So I came to Coffee and Clarity for the first time, and I had no idea what I was getting myself into. And that first session, I was so moved and I felt so at home that I just started to share with other women how important I thought that it would be for them to be there to kind of share their experiences and their stories about the things that they're going through in their everyday.
Some women that can reach a certain age group or a certain culture or things like that. But the thing about Tiffany is when you look at Coffee and Clarity, and I've seen this, and this was one of the things when I tell other people, it's not an age thing, it's not a black thing, it's not a white thing. It is just a God thing. And
being able to open up with the other women, and then just see where that conversation spiraled into. It was really amazing, and you could just feel that God was working in that conversation with these women. So I can't say enough about Tiffany, that she's totally a blessing in my life, and I really connect with the women.
I'm just transitioning to my spiritual journey as far as learning God, and today was really something I needed to, things I needed to hear, and it really guided me to, I feel like I can do anything. Like I just feel, I don't know, like coming into this, I was confused about a lot, but now I feel a little bit more like I have a direction.
You can grab your ticket and RSVP for Coffee and Clarity, Purpose Over Pandemics, with the link in the show notes. And of course, before I let you go, before you hit that link, take a moment wherever you are listening and leave a review. Because of course, when you do, you are blessing another beacon like you who is looking for a community and a guide on this here journey of bouncing back. Before I let you go, I gotta let you know, God is not going to play you. But if you are allowing unforgiveness, distractions, or your lack of discipline give room for imposter syndrome to take over your life, I promise you are playing yourself. Be blessed.